always have. You gotta be prepared.
So what'd you do?
USB to USB-C, need a HDMI, or just like, there's so many ports.
So nice to be
It's
organized.
it's absurd how many different ports we need.
You don't have a Pennsylvania?
We did.
I just hope somebody needs to help.
Absolutely, I've got my cards here as well, and then we'll get our contact information.
Is there a way to access this?
I'm sure they'll have the slides available afterwards, I would imagine. If not, you can take one of my cards, or we'll get contact information at the end, and you can contact us.
I suspect.
Do we think folks are still trickling in? You guys have been like downstairs and.
Yeah, I just, I mean, it's 79.
Yeah, there was 30, it said 38 people signed up, so, but,
We had to sign up for this?
no, they just, through the app, you can see which sessions you're going to, so it's, I'll put it on there. So, do you know? Gentlemen, are we live streaming or no?
Yes.
We are. Do we have people online?
Currently, no.
Are we ready to go?
Should we start? Yeah.
Oh no, we started live.
Okay, I mean, should we start the presentation?
Oh yes, you can start. I'm sorry, yes. But there's no one in there currently.
Thank you. We're from CEEJH too.
Oh,
Region II Puerto Rico.
oh, okay. This is just, so it's not about the TCTAC really, it's just grant writing 101.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, but we also do that too.
Okay.
Just checking if we're on the same page.
We're happy to have you.
Yeah, let's go. We're done, we get to that.
I'm sorry.
We get to that.
Yeah, we're just getting our feet under us.
Oh, I'm ready to move my own slides. I'm not working with slides.
Ready the next slide?
Ready to go? Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Kelsey Brooks. I'm a program manager with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland.
I'm Odessa Burian. I'm Assistant Director at the Environmental Finance Center.
And we are going to be talking about grant writing 101. So what do you need to think about before you apply for a grant? What do you need to think about and have prepared as you're applying for a grant? Next slide. Thank you. So we're going to talk today about pre-grant development. How do you find funding opportunities? How do you get prepared? And then we're going to talk about grant development. So obviously every grant application is a little bit different, but there are some common grant elements that you can have sort of on hand to be ready to apply. We'll talk about timeline, budgets, and common attachments. We're just gonna dive right in. Okay, so next slide. Pre-grant development. How do you go about finding funding opportunities when you're trying to locate something to fund a project? So the federal government right now has a lot of funding opportunities, right? We all know the bipartisan infrastructure legislation funding. The IRA has released a lot of money. It's available through a lot of different programs and funders. It's difficult to navigate where those funding sources are. One of the best places to start is grants.gov. That is a warehouse for all of the federal funding opportunities, what is currently available, what is soon to be available. And it's like any sort of search engine that you would navigate. There are options that you can filter by. Next slide. There we go. Okay. This is a quick video. I think we would have brought this up live, but in terms of who here is familiar with grants.gov and has used it? Okay, so kind of a little bit of a mix. If you're not familiar with using the search function of grants.gov, can you hit play on the video? Let's see if it works. All smaller, that's fine. Next slide. So when you go to grants.gov, there are a bunch of different ways to filter through the opportunity. These are all going to be on sort of like the left-hand column side of the page. One is opportunity status, so that is whether or not the grant is currently open, whether it is forecasted. They also have closed and archived grants. You can see things that have been previously funded. Funding instrument type, so you would largely probably be looking at grants. There's also cooperative agreements. Cooperative agreements are somewhat similar to grants, but instead of a federal agency giving you money that you report on, that federal agency is more involved in the execution of the project. So if you need technical assistance from a federal agency, a cooperative agreement can be a really great option because they will be working hand in hand with you through that process. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the community change grants. It's been brought up quite a bit throughout the conference. EPA is treating a number of those as cooperative agreements. You can sort by eligibility, and so that would be, are you a nonprofit, are you a local government, are you a utility, sort of whatever category that you fall into. It's worth noting that within the eligibility search section, in addition to clicking, oh, I'm a nonprofit, there's also an other category which you would probably always want to select, just because grants can be written in different ways and you might fall under that other. So be a little careful with that search criteria because you don't want to exclude grant opportunities that you might actually be eligible for by narrowing things too much. Category is sort of what your project is about. So it might be energy, environment, health, food, those sort of broad categories. So if you know, hey, I'm doing a community garden, a food-based project, you might want to sort by food. And then finally, you can filter by agency. I don't know how much folks actually want to use that. I guess if you're looking for something very specific, you might want to sort by agency or filter by agency, but sometimes agencies fund stuff you might not expect. So better to sort of leave that open and see what you get back. There is also sort of a keyword function at the top, but we recommend using the filters instead of the keywords for the same reason. You don't want to exclude something that you might be eligible for and might actually be a fit for your program. But grants.gov is a great place to start looking for federal opportunities. But that's if you say, I have a project, I need funding, okay, let me go and look. What if you have a project in mind, if there's not funding available and you are interested in things coming to you, there's other options. Next slide. So you can sign up for listservs. Many federal agencies have listservs. EPA has one, and again, we can share these slides out so these links become clickable because we don't want you to have to write down this long URL by any means. And unlike you going and saying, okay, I'm sitting down, let me go to grants.gov and look for a funding opportunity right now, EPA will tell you, hey, this funding opportunity has become available. Mentioned before, cooperative agreements. So the U.S. Forest Service is an agency that does quite a few cooperative agreements. And again, if you are a community that says, we want to do this project, but maybe we don't have the technical knowledge to execute it, or we want to build our capacity to execute a technical project, a cooperative agreement can be a great option for that, working with a federal entity. And then some agencies have, again, these unusual, or less common, I should say, funding opportunities. And so again, getting back to those filters of, you'll see a lot of grants, a lot of cooperative agreements, and you'll also see an other category. DOE, the Department of Energy, for instance, has competitions and prizes, right? And those aren't going to function like a grant, but it might be a good option for you, particularly if you're doing something research adjacent with DOE. Next slide. Okay, so those are federal opportunities, but they're not the only funders you'll be able to find. States often have their own funding opportunities as well. We are working in EPA Region 3, so these are all focused on our region, but there's some international. You can search the website of state agencies, so similar to like EPA might have resources, your state environmental regulatory agency might have a listserv and resources that you can sign up for. Or they might maintain a web page where all that information is listed. So joining those state listservs can also be worthwhile. There are also these opportunity aggregators. So some of them are program specific. So the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency is going to be energy focused. So if you're looking for funding for an energy project, that might be a place you want to go. And again, some of them are going to be state specific. So There are external aggregators that maintain some grant opportunities, but again, states will often maintain their own pages of, hey, this is what's currently available, this is what's coming up, so it's worth taking a look at that. Next slide. In addition to state opportunities, you might have more local funding opportunities. So the county that you're located in might fund projects, and again, you'd have to go to your county's website or contact a grants administrator at your county to see what they are funding. You might also have local community development funders. So this might be a like governmental agency who funds things within your region, within your locality. Foundation and philanthropic funds are an alternative as well. So these can be regional or national also, or they could be, again, these more local or regional community foundations. One of the benefits of philanthropic funding is they may have a less traditional approach to the application process and also the reporting process. Federal funds come with a lot of requirements. Philanthropic funds sometimes come with fewer or easier to manage requirements, whether that's checking in with your grant manager in a less formal way, and the reporting requirements may be less stringent. Or a third other funding place to look is other NGOs. So sometimes larger non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, have re-grant opportunities, so they get funding in, and then they can re-grant smaller amounts to other community-based organizations. But again, they might be an opportunity for a partnership. They might have the capacity to help you apply for larger grants. So starting to build those relationships with other nonprofits working in your field who might be pursuing similar funding can be a great way to identify that funding. All right, very close, next slide. Thank you. If you go through our Region 3 TCTAC, Revenue Technical Assistance Center intake process, one of the tools that we've been building at the Environmental Finance Center is a grants database. So this is through Airtable, and basically what we are doing is we're doing this work of scouring grants.gov, state and local opportunities, and we are routinely updating a database of funding opportunities. Once you're through the intake process and you can see this Airtable, it's sorted by a couple of different tabs, so you can either look at things and say, okay, this is the full list of opportunities. We have a calendar view, so when things are due, when things open. We have a view that will tell you, oh, this is a letter of intent, which we'll get into in a little bit, versus this is a full application. And it's also sorted by who's eligible for the grant, where the grant applies. So some of these, again, are going to be national grants. Some of these are going to be state-specific. We have the Chesapeake Bay, of course, so some of them are bay-specific, or maybe Delaware River watershed-specific. So a bunch of different ways to sort of sort through grants, as well as topic areas. So again, if you're looking for a tree program or something.
The hubs do have access to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and anyone who goes through the TCTAC intake process can also be added to this.
Next slide. So this is another view. So when you actually click on a grant, what it pulls up: start date, name of the program, focus area, summary, whether there's a match or a cost share requirement, the funding available, the award period, so how long you have to spend the funds, and then also some links so you can go and look directly at the RFP. So that's a really broad overview of where to look for funding opportunities. Of course, if you need assistance looking for funding opportunities, we can help with that as well. And so once you've identified a funding opportunity, or even before you've identified a funding opportunity, what are some things you should have on hand to apply for a grant? And so with this pre-grant development and getting prepared section, these are things that are useful to have on hand, keep updated. You don't know when funding opportunities are going to become available, but again, these are sort of common elements that you'll see across many, many funding opportunities. Next slide. So, information to have on hand, things that grants routinely request, qualifications. So this is a summary of your organization. Who are you? What are you trying to do? What is the context of your work, right? These are things that you know. These are things that are going to feed into many grants. It's great to have this on hand so you can just pull it and then plug it into whatever format you need for the grant. So Qualifications include a short history of your organization, your organization's mission. It would also include bios or resumes for your team members. Oftentimes grants request that kind of information, and any participating partners you have. So if you have routine partnerships, you might want to keep that on hand, as well as examples of your previous success with the type of work you're proposing. Again, you know, have you managed similar funds before? How have you executed the project? Have you shown that you can execute a project similar to what you're applying for? And that feeds into past performance as well. So success that you've had securing and managing grant funds. So once you complete a project, right, a grant funded project, write that up, have it on hand. You don't have to rewrite it every single time that you apply for a grant. It's a bit more efficient. Next slide. You're going to want to, when you do find a funding opportunity or find something that might seem like a good funding opportunity, your first step is going to be determining whether you are eligible for that funding. So you're going to want to review the funding announcement to see if your organization is eligible, right? We talked about sorting by nonprofits. Some grant opportunities are not available to nonprofits, right? They're for local governments, they're for other entities. You're going to want to make sure the grant aligns with your project goals. You're going to look and see that the deadline is manageable. So if you find a grant and it's due tomorrow, you might not be able to pull that together in the time that it would take to do that. So make sure that the deadline is something that you can hit and that you have the capacity to apply for the grant. So again, different grant opportunities, depending if they're federal, state, local, philanthropic, are going to require different amounts of effort to put the grant application together. Make sure you have the capacity to do that. Depending on the structure of your organization, you might also need to advise your board of directors and obtain their pre-approval that you're applying for a grant. Again, depends on the structure of your organization. We do want to point out that announcements go by many different names, so you might see something called a request for proposal or an RFP, a request for applications or an RFA, a notice of funding opportunity or a NOFO, or a letter of intent or an LOI. RFP, RFA, NOFO, kind of used interchangeably. A letter of intent might be a little bit different. That's something that you put in with that needs less of a lift. So it's writing to a funder and saying, hey, we want to apply for this. And then they come back to you and say, yeah, you can apply for this. And then it's a larger application after the fact.
What is an MOU? How does that fall into that framework?
Okay, so an MOU is a memorandum of understanding. Memoranda. And that is an agreement between you and another entity. So you might need an MOU between you and a partner, depending on a grant application. And an MOU might also come into play after you receive a grant.
So like, I guess the reason I asked, so like in community change, it says you have to have a partnership between two organizations or an institution of higher learning, and that would be in the form of an MOU.
Yeah, so that's, I think they call it a statutory partner in the grant. And there is a very formal requirement within the community change grant specifically for that, yeah.
So that's not normally between, you know, an organization and its funder, it'd be more, you know, the partner level.
Yeah, you know, the further you get into anything, right, the more alphabet soup, acronyms, and people who are used to living in this world will very casually be like, the NOFO, and you'll be like, what? So yes, just a quick note about those terms. Okay, next slide. If you are applying for federal funding, and even if you are not applying for federal funding right now, you might want to do this anyway, you need to be registered with sam.gov, and you have to receive a unique entity ID. Sometimes you'll just see it as like a UEID, I think. So this is a registration of your organization with the federal government, and it's the way that they do all of their federal funding. So good idea to just sign up now, because it doesn't hurt. And if you ever decide to go after federal funding, you will need it. And once you register with sam.gov, then you also need to register with grants.gov. That's how you end up applying for federal funding as well. So you can't register for grants.gov until you register for sam.gov, so you have to go in that order, and it can take a little bit of time. So again, thinking through the timeline for applying for a grant, if you haven't done this, it's going to put you out a couple weeks, which is why you might just want to do it now, because it doesn't hurt. Other grantors may also have their own websites, their own portals, the way that you apply. They might have their own registration requirements. So that's another really important thing to take a look at, again, when you're figuring out the timeline of your grant application. What are the things I need to set up beforehand so that I am capable of applying? It's also worth noting that within these portals, within grants.gov, you will sometimes find the standard forms that are required. Sometimes these standard forms are only accessible through the portal and through grants.gov once you sign up for that, for these systems. And so it's important to also take a look at those forms and what those forms require as early as possible, again, so you can get those done by the time that you apply for the grant. You don't want to write your narrative and then be ready to submit and find out like, oh, I need to get all this information that I don't have, and not be able to apply when you're more or less ready to do so. Okay, next slide. So you figured out, okay, I'm eligible, I'm registered in SAM.gov and grants.gov, it fits my project. How do I get support to apply for the grant? So there's a couple of different places that you can look, and again, this is very broad, not all of these might apply to a given grant, but these are things to look for. There may be webinars that the funder does that you can sign up for. EPA keeps a list of previous webinars on their website. So again, if you're looking at an opportunity that maybe is now closed, but you know it's going to open again, you can take a look at those recorded webinars. Or it might just be helpful to see, you know, what they recommend sort of broadly for their applications. Many grant opportunities develop FAQ documents. With federal opportunities, again, these documents are updated sort of regularly, so it's a good thing to take a look, come back in a couple weeks, check again, see what gets put into the FAQ documents. You might see contact info for grant program managers, and this is something we really recommend. Don't be afraid to reach out to the grant program managers. They are there to help you understand the program, answer questions that you have. It's good practice to run your project by the grant manager. Some grants require it. They are not the enemy. They are there to help you and make sure your project fits the grant. So if that information is available, and it's particularly if they call it out as being something you need to do, right, you're going to want to do that as soon as you can. Some grants have office hours, so unlike contacting the grant manager, these are set times that you can sign up for. Many times they fill up, so again, as soon as you realize that this is a grant you want to apply for and you see office hours, sign up for them. Some grants have specific technical assistance programs. The CEEJH grant had specific technical assistance, although that's now closed, so I don't know if I should mention it, but not limited to community change grants. So that might also be something that you can sign up for and again, get help as you're going through the grant. Funders have resource guides. They might also keep examples on their website, particularly this long-running grant program with multiple years of funding. But sign up for everything. You can't get enough help applying for a grant, really. Next slide. Oh, I think we're switching up now. This is
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move away from what you need to have beforehand and more common elements for the grant.
Any questions for Kelsey before I move on? Sure, go
I
ahead.
had a question in regards to that chart you had. I missed, how do you access it? The one where you triaged, where you're intake form with
Oh. Yeah, so through the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers for EPA Region 3, there's an intake form on the National Wildlife Federation's website. So it's a fairly quick intake form. It's not super in-depth. It won't take you a long time to do it, but sign up for that. You'll get referred to us and we can add you to this.
So it's an intake form on the National Wildlife Federation
Yes.
website?
I can give you a card that's got a little QR code on the back of it for me.
Oh, and I think we're gonna have a QR code at the end.
We'll have the QR code.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
And just note, I would say note in that intake form that you're interested in being connected to the grants database.
Okay.
So we can get you signed up quickly.
Good question.
Any other questions?
If anything comes up later, we're looking.
That's right. Okay, well, hi again. I'm Nadessa, and in case you recently came in, I just wanted to back us up a little bit and say that Environmental Finance Center, we are a part of the Region 3 TCTAC. Does anybody not know the acronym TCTAC? Is that familiar to everybody? Thriving Community Technical Assistance Center. And through that, we are charged with providing technical assistance on connecting our wonderful hub partners like Renato here from West Virginia State, and then their constituents really with technical assistance for grant writing. So we can work with you one-on-one or in group settings like this where we're talking about grant proposals. We have office hours also where we can meet one-on-one with folks to really help talk through your projects, help you find the right funding opportunity, And really, we can go so far as rolling up our sleeves and really helping you walk through those applications. So even though we're at a university, we're 100% self-funded, we've probably written well over 100 grant applications. So, yeah, that's what we're here for, and just want to give you a little bit of background on why we're here today. So, I am going to go through some common elements in your grant proposal. So, next slide, please. So let's start from the beginning, right? We have your title and your abstract. So titles, they matter. You know, first impressions matter, right? This is the first thing that a funder is going to see. So you want to make sure that it's catchy. You want to be brief. You want it to be clear. And again, that's the first thing your reviewer is going to see. So think about that title. Next is your abstract. So here we also want to be compelling. This is, you know, one of the other first things that a grant reviewer is going to see. So part of that is defining the problem that's at hand and also presenting a solution. So you want to clearly define the problem to be addressed, and you really want to try to tie that to the funding agency's priorities. Hopefully your priorities are in line with the priorities of the funder that you're applying to, so you just really want to keep that in mind, so know your audience. Again, this may be one of the single most important things. So you want to identify and specify the conditions that you hope to change, and you really want to also support this by evidence. So you don't want to just say there's a problem. You want to use statistics. You want to use data to back up the problem, even if you've done your own research or again, health statistics, environmental statistics. That's going to help you define the problem. All right. And part of that too is your solution. Here's an example of a project that we recently did with the Maryland Black Mayors. So I'm just going to use this as an example. So title, getting the most for Maryland Black Mayors. Okay, this is catchy because the most actually stands for a training program that we have that was familiar by the funder. It's Municipal Online Stormwater Training Center. So it's kind of serving two purposes there. It's talking about one of our programs, but then we're also going to get the most for our target audience. Okay, going through the abstract here, you can see that, okay, Maryland Black Mayors request funds to launch the Getting the Most for Maryland Black Mayors program, representing African American mayors that serve residents in 16 municipalities across Prince George's County. 100% of MBM leaders surveyed identified a lack of environmental related education and outreach programs targeted to their elected leaders and municipal staff. So this defines the problem, right? We did a survey, 100% of the people surveyed identified this was a problem. So it clearly states the problem. Okay, urgency. This results in a disproportionate lack of resources that could be utilized to decrease pollution, improve public health, and bring resources back to these overburdened and underserved communities. So that clearly defines that there's an urgency in this. We actually went on to state statistics and more data, but yeah, this is just a shortened version here. That brings us to the solution down in green, just talking about what we will do in order to bring about this outcome. I don't need to read the whole thing to you, but you can see that it's broken up into those three segments. Next slide. Okay, then we're going to go on to your goals versus objectives. So a goal is really a broad statement about the overall outcome that you want to achieve. And objectives are going to support those goals. So they're going to lay out the activities that you want to accomplish, and they're going to be very clear and specific. You may have heard about the SMART acronym, so that's always a good guideline to use when you're writing your objectives for your project. So that is specific, you want to use action words. Measurable, you want to use metrics or data targets. Achievable, you wanna make sure that the objective, it's really within your scope of capabilities and also the time frame of your project. Realistic, you wanna make sure that each objective is a real solution to a real problem. And time bound, you always wanna have a time component to your objective. Just a few other tips for objectives. You want to list them pretty succinctly, like no more than 1 or 2 sentences. And also it's nice to list them in order of importance. And just make sure you don't confuse your objectives with the ends with your means, with the outputs. So the means for getting there. We're going to talk about outputs in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so here's an example going back to the project I referred to. So our project goal was providing watershed-based education and training for elected and municipal staff. Moving on to one of our objectives, I'm just going to show one here, but by the end of the project, you can also put a month and a year here, so if you know your project's going to go through December of 25, that's perfectly acceptable. So that's your time-bound portion. Elected officials and staff in at least 10 participating NBM communities will have an increased understanding. Okay, so that's specific and achievable. So the proposals also laid out that there were 16 communities and our goal was to reach 10. So that's achievable and very specific. Increased understanding, that's measurable. So we did a pre-post test to be able to measure that outcome. There's many different ways you can measure, but that is what we included here. And of the value of understanding stormwater management, participating in the county's programs, and to better connect constituents with funding opportunities and resources. So again, that's specific and realistic. I would also say that your objectives are really the basis for your evaluation that you're going to do at the end. So the better your objectives are, the easier it's going to be to write your evaluation section. Are there questions so far? Any questions? Okay. Do we have folks online? No?
This is very, to me, reminiscent of like writing a scientific paper where you have a question and you're trying to answer it with data and then you draw conclusions from that data.
Yeah.
So, to me, coming from like that world, that's
Right.
to me what it reminds me of.
Yeah, absolutely similar. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, here are outputs versus outcomes. So, outputs, they are your activities to be accomplished. So just a few examples here. You know, if you're conducting workshops or trainings, you're delivering services, you're developing products or resources or curriculum maybe. Maybe you're doing environmental education curriculum. If you're facilitating meetings, if you're doing air quality monitoring, those types of things are outputs. So the things that you will be doing, the tasks to be accomplished. If you're ever confused about an output versus an outcome, a good rule of thumb is that if a number can be tied to it, it's likely an output. So it'd be like, I'm going to do 3 workshops. I'm going to develop, I'm going to hold 5 meetings, that kind of thing. So that can help you distinguish between the two. Okay, outcomes, on the other hand, is the impact or the change that's going to happen as a result of your activity. So there's short-term outcomes like increasing in knowledge, awareness, attitude, skills, and then moving on to your medium or long-term outcomes will be more behavior, decision-making, and then policy, environmental or economic changes. While funders do like to see mostly those medium or long-term outcomes, they're difficult, right? And it takes a lot of time. So if you're doing a year project, it might be difficult to make these, policy or environmental changes. So it really just depends on the proposal that you're writing and the funding opportunity. Okay, I've got some examples on the next slide from our project. So again, this is from the Maryland Black Mayors Project. So our outputs, we facilitated a kickoff event, one kickoff event. Again, there are those numbers. Developed 4 course curriculum. We facilitated bi-weekly peer-to-peer discussions. And I didn't put a number in this last one, but it should have been. Developed 10 stormwater action plans. And you can see the outcome of that was really increased awareness and increased skills. Okay, any questions about outputs versus outcomes? All right. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, how do you use your goals as kind of a guide for these outputs or outcomes? It seems like you could tie them directly, but I'm just wondering how closely they're related.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that it's tied to the long-term impacts of your development. The long-term outcomes of the project is usually associated with the goal.
Right, sure. So, yeah, these are really ways, activities that you're gonna take to be able to achieve your goal. So yeah, goal is kind of tied to your outcome, if that makes sense. Okay, next slide, please. Next, milestone schedule. Milestones and timelines are always nice to include in your grant proposal, whether or not they're required or not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But you really want to communicate to your funder the timeline of your project. So a milestone schedule is really going to just show how your activities are sequenced throughout the life of the project. And this is a lot of times done in a table. And you can get really fancy with this, but you don't have to. Some people use Gantt charts, and you can really, I'll show you an example on the next slide, but it can just as easily be done in Word or Excel. So you can see it supports and supplements your activities, your output section, and it really just shows that you've thought through your project, you've thought through all the steps, and make sure that you stay on track. So if you go to the next slide, it's a really simple example. So we took each of our outputs and then outlined the activities that went under each output. So if you're going to do an event, you've got to develop your communication and outreach materials. You've got to secure a location. You can just see the different steps there. So it can be very, very simple like this, and just include the months that it's going to occur. If you move on to the next slide, that shows an example of a timeline, which is a little bit different. Very similar, but a timeline also lists out the outputs and activities, and it's a visual representation of kind of the duration, milestones, and outputs. So here, you can really see, for example, like when your busy months are going to be. So you see like in months, 3 through 4, you've got like 3 or 4 different things going on. So that will help you as a project team know, okay, I really am gonna need all hands on deck during this time. Or maybe you wanna rethink things. If everything's following and you've got everything happening in a couple months or really concentrated, you might wanna think about moving those things around. So again, you can get so fancy with this, but you don't have to. Something simple like this can really do the job. Alrighty, next slide. Okay, on to one of my favorite topics, budget. You gotta love budgets.
I just want to make a comment
yes.
about the timeline and milestone table.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes before jumping into budget, it's so useful to have that
Mm-hmm.
table done already, because when you do the budget, then you look through the activity and say, oh, okay, I need budget for this. Like if I'm expected to finish, marketing plan in 2 months, I need to contract somebody to do it.
That's
Because
right.
I won't have staff. So to do that table first and then do budget, I think is
Yes.
so useful.
That's a perfect point, a perfect segue. Go to the next slide. So, when you've done all of these things and you've thought through your activities, that's exactly right. You're going to use those in order to write your budget. So here are some common categories that are included, typically included in your budget. Of course, personnel, fringe benefits, travel, that's gonna be everything. You gotta think through all of your activities, you know. Are you gonna be renting a car? Are you gonna use your personal car? You gotta do, you know, mileage for your personal car. They're gonna be tolls, or you're gonna, you know, have per diem to eat food. Are you gonna have parking costs, all of airfare, hotels? So you just, you know, wanna think through each step of your project to come up with these numbers. Equipment, supplies and materials, contractual, a lot of times there are also an additional item for a sub-award or a sub-grant. It's gonna depend on your funding opportunity. Other direct costs, you might want to include participant incentives, like if you're having focus groups or if you're involving the community at all, you definitely want to build in funds to reimburse folks and give them incentives to participate. And then your indirect costs. If your organization doesn't have a NICRA, that's a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, de minimis is 10%. If you move to the next slide, there is, budget justification. So that's really an important component as well. So that's going to be a separate section from your budget where you're literally going to have to write out in narrative form and explain everything that was included in your budget. Let's see, I already went through most of this, but so for supplies, you're going to want to include, again, printing materials like agendas for meetings. Maybe you're, you know, planting trees. Whatever you're doing, you just got to think carefully through each section. Next slide, please. Matching funds. So this is a fun topic. So some grant programs or funders require matching funds. It also sometimes goes by cost share. Even if they don't, if it's possible, it's nice to include this because it kind of shows you got some skin in the game, right? But I know it's a very difficult topic. Most of us can't do that. But the different types of matching funds or cost share. One is cash match, so that is actual dollars you would expend on your project that are not part of the proposal, that you cannot bill to the grant. So an example, we're currently working with a town on a project, and their cost share was, it's about stormwater management and flooding. They are contributing rain barrels, so they can write that off as cost share. We put that in our proposal. You can also do travel costs that you're gonna just incur on your own. You can do, you know, equipment rentals. If you're gonna put staff, if some of your staff are gonna be working on the project but they're not billed to the grant, you can use that for cost share. In-kind match would be non-cash contributions to a project. So that's gonna be volunteer time. That's going to be loaned equipment, donated supplies, things of that nature. So you always want to be careful not to double dip. So anything you're counting as cost share on one project, you can't count it as cost share on another project. And I would also just caution to track it closely as you go along. That's a lesson that I'm learning right now. At the end of a 3-year grant, I've realized we did not do a good job tracking our cost share, and I'm paying for it right now. It's really difficult to go back and try it. It was a 1-to-1 cost share on a $200,000 grant, so it's tough. So you just want to really be careful about tracking along the way. Next slide is just a very simple example of a budget. It really talks about it just goes through all the different categories we talked about, and also puts some notes in that we might include on a budget justification. Any questions about budgets?
When you hear the terminology like drawdown, what does that indicate? It says like it has to be drawn down X amount of percent or something.
That's how much you've spent so far.
And so some grants mandate you
Yes.
spend a certain amount over the lifetime of the grant?
Yes, so, you know, you would just have to look at your financials and, yeah, just report on percent drawdown. Yeah, we have to do that with some of our grants as well, so, yeah. That's not terribly common.
That's good.
But,
Where's your money?
yeah. But yeah, that's simply all it is. And sometimes you have to do it for each category, but a lot of times it's just overall. Any other questions about budget? Yes.
Yes, so I'm wondering if, say, the other criteria for a grant fit your project very specifically, but say maybe the amount is actually more than you propose in, say, a budget, but you would potentially like to have some of that money just in case. I mean, how do people feel if, say, your budget falls short of the amount that they're offering, and what happens in that instance?
So as a funder, if they see
It's like a
that you haven't
$25,000.
accounted for your costs, that's a red flag.
No, not that
Okay.
you haven't accounted, say, $25,000 grant, what you're putting together, the project cost might be 19, 20,000. What, if there's that $5,000 discrepancy, do you end up getting that?
No,
Okay.
no.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to.
Right, no, not typically, you certainly, yeah.
So
They're not gonna give you any more than you apply for, but it could be a red flag if, you know, for example, if you didn't think through your budget carefully, you're saying that you're gonna, you know, I don't know, you do all these off-site meetings, but you didn't include travel, you know, that's a red flag that you didn't think through the whole process. Am I answering your question? So they're not gonna give you more than you propose.
Yeah,
Some grants have minimums, right, so you can't apply for less than what the minimum is. Some grants don't have minimums, and so that's gonna be in the RFP or the RFA or whatever as well, like, you know.
okay. I'm also learning a little bit about the grant process.
So in your opinion, is it worth asking for the maximum amount that's offered?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
it depends, if it's really competitive, I mean, we've gone in a little bit under before, just to try to give us that little edge if we know that it's a very competitive, there's, you know, gonna be hundreds of applicants, and there's only gonna, you know, be a few getting an award. It's a slippery slope, right? You gotta put in enough to cover your costs, but, you know, if you wanna try to come down a little bit,
I guess in my head, I'm thinking like, you know, like, if you're putting costs in, to me, like, when you're filling out these budgets, you're going like straight retail pricing, say, if you wanna, like, we did a grant at my university to buy a tractor. It's not like they're gonna buy a used tractor down the street to save $10,000, they're gonna go to the vendor and ask for what it would cost brand new off the lot.
Okay, so it's almost budgeting for like kind of worst case, not worst case scenario, but you're not budgeting for as much savings as we could possibly
Correct.
have. Yeah, okay,
Correct.
all right.
Yeah, that was something that was always fascinating to me, because it's like, oh, I'm gonna try to save money by doing this. It's like, no, that's not how it works. You
No.
have to envision like you're going to the spot and buying it directly from them.
oh yeah, you wanna make sure your costs are covered, cause you're not gonna get any more.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
I have two. The first one, is it common to have like a contingency, like a miscellaneous item on your budget to kind of like for
In case.
in case? And the second is, how is the indirect cost, the federal negotiated indirect cost rate is determined?
So let me take your first question first. So really, the other direct costs would be the only place that you could put miscellaneous, and you've really gotta define, you know, what that cost is. I mean, you can certainly pad some things here and there to make sure that you've got, you know, enough room in your budget, but yeah, you have to put a specific, use for that cost. You can't just, you can't have a miscellaneous item. Yeah, I've never seen that.
Yeah, but I think to the earlier point of like, be conservative in your estimates in the sense of like, I think it's gonna take me 10 hours to do this. You can budget for 12 hours.
15, yeah.
12, 15 hours. And then most funders too, if you get into the project, will allow us like budget adjustments, not more money, but you might say, oh, I actually need more money for food for an event and less money for
Yes.
my time, and they'll let you like move funds around in that way. So, but yeah, if you think this is gonna take me 10 hours, and you have the space in the grant to budget for 15 hours, and you budget for 15 hours.
You can usually move between categories cost up to 10% without getting funder approval, at least on the federal level. And then, I'm sorry, your second
The
question.
second was the federal negotiated rate, how is that determined?
Yeah, so that is an agreement between an organization and a funder. You know, like for example, universities have federally negotiated rates, but I don't believe nonprofits would have that.
They do.
They do, okay.
Sometimes, yeah, and then if you don't, then you use that de minimis
10%.
Understood.
Yeah,
The process, there's a webinar on the EPA website that
Okay.
talks about how it's done. You have to show, like, as an NGO, lots of your financials and your staffing and all of that, and based on, because universities has research labs, we have like a whole big other structure, but NGOs can negotiate the rates. You have to have a lot of people, like single audit documentation and stuff, so a lot of NGOs just go for the minimum.
Understood.
Yeah, and it's a process.
It's a counting process.
How are we doing on time?
We have 17 minutes.
17? Okay, great. Okay, next slide. Okay, letters of support versus letters of commitment. So both of these can really bolster your proposal. Letters of support are gonna articulate general next slide please. General support for your grant request, and this should really describe the author's involvement with your organization or community and how the funding will help address a need. So this can be somebody that can write a letter of support, like if you've worked with them and you've provided services to them in the past, that would be a great letter of support. Any individuals or organizations that kind of benefit from what you do. You can also, another great place would be like a government official, a mayor, state or federal legislator, or any other stakeholder that might have an interest in you receiving a grant to do this work. Letters of commitment, next slide. So letters of commitment are gonna demonstrate your partner's involvement with the project and the specific contributions they're gonna make. So if you have a partner, really letters of commitment, are the way to go. So that's gonna talk about your collaboration with this partner, their role in the proposed project, if they're gonna do any cost share, if they're gonna do any monetary support, or if they're gonna do any, in-kind support in terms of space, supplies, staff time. Letters of commitment are really, really important to have in a proposal. As you can see, if possible, you should get letters of commitment. They're a little bit stronger. Questions about letters of support versus letters of commitment? Okay, next, submit your grant. So, you always want to do a final review of your grant. You want to make sure you've gone through that checklist to make sure you have all those required elements. You want to look at, there's usually an evaluation criteria section. After you've written everything, you want to go through that very carefully, see how many points are given to each section. You might not want to pay as much attention to a 5-pointer versus a 20, pointer or more. So you want to really look at that, about those evaluation criteria. Make sure you've gotten all your required forms, you've got your resumes, you've got all your letters, all PDF'd nicely together. And, those federal grants, there's a lot of those federal forms. We could have a whole other, class on the federal forms. So after that, you're ready to submit. Okay, so here is a QR code that you can scan to register for TCTAC services. And also we, after you do that, we're always gonna ask you to do that intake process first. And then there is also a link for signing up for office hours with us. Again, like I talked about, we can work with folks one-on-one, talking about your projects and just providing you with some whatever assistance that you need in terms of your grant writing. All right, thanks everybody. Next, you can just actually leave that up, the other one up if you want, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about timeline to prepare to submit for the grant? Like, the grant opens and you have 2 months, like, when you should be,
Right away.
like, when you should have the draft ready and like 3 weeks before the closing day, 2 weeks?
Well, it's gonna depend on your organization, right? So if, for example, you have to send it to, you know, if you have a board of directors, you know, that's gonna have to review it. In our case, we have an office of research that we have to do at least 2 weeks beforehand. Just, it always takes you longer than you think, especially if you're working with partners. You know, it's giving them space, you always give them a deadline that's, you know, a week or two beforehand. But I always would say just get started right away.
I'm new to learning about the TCTAC. Who's eligible to do an intake? Or I volunteer with different organizations and trying to share information.
So environmental justice groups,
Okay, nonprofits.
yeah, nonprofits, CEOs.
Okay, cool.
Hi, so I have a question about eligibility. So toward the beginning of the session, I know you were discussing like selecting other for different categorizations of kind of what your entity is. I work for a network and it can be really difficult to define the work we do because we're not a 501c3, we're not a CBO, we aren't like an academic institution. So what would your recommendations be for networks specifically to find funding?
It's a good question. I think a lot of federal funds are not going to, like, you're not going to fit under that. Whether or not there's an entity that can apply for funding for your network, I think is a question. So you touched on partnerships. And I think with sorting through federal funds, that's important too, of you might identify an opportunity and say, my organization can't apply for this, but I know someone who can and we can partner. And that applies for any kind of entity, right? Like, there can be local government funding and you're an NGO, but if you can build your partnership with your local government, they can apply on your behalf and manage the funds and you can give the funding. But I think with networks, like philanthropic funding is
That's what I was
probably
gonna say,
the primary
philanthropic.
option for that.
Thank you.
Getting one of your partners to.
Yeah, partnerships, yeah, would probably be, the best way to go.
Thank you.
Other questions? Any questions online? Okay, streaming's not working. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for attending. We have a booth downstairs with some fact sheets for a few open RFPs, and I have a card here if you want any information.
Yeah.
Was I not on the right one?